about part two of our argument persuasive unit. And we're going into the lessons folder, as you can see, and we're scrolling down to lesson 6, essay 3, argument slash persuasive, which corresponds with chapter 14, part 2 of your text. So let's go in there, okay, and we're going to scroll down, and we're going to talk about pathos, ethos, and logos. Okay. Now, when we do a persuasive argument, we want to base it in fact as much as possible. Okay. Logos, meaning logic, okay, is the factual part of an argument. Pathos is the emotional part of an argument, and ethos is the ethical or credentialed part of an argument. So for our case, we're going with roughly 95% logos, okay? Mostly because as humans, okay, we all have logic. Okay? Some of us use it better than others, but for the most part, we all have it, okay? We all have emotion as well. However, not everybody responds to emotions in the same way, right? Some people will get sad and upset at certain things, and other people won't get sad and upset at certain things. Some people will laugh in certain situations, and some people will not laugh in certain situations. It's an iffy proposition, okay? Which is why we want to go with logic, all right? With logic, it's hard to argue because logic is based in facts and evidence, okay? And when you present a fact, while it can be argued, it's not easy to argue. It's the hardest to argue, okay? So percentage-wise, we want to build our essay roughly 95% logos, logic, and then a combination of pathos and ethos for the remaining 5%. The ethos is the credibility, okay? And the credibility for us becomes our secondary sources, mostly because we're not experts in the topics that we're talking about here with argument. Um, but when we make an argument and we present evidence, we want our argument to be as solid as possible. So sometimes we have to borrow credibility from an expert, okay? And that's what ethos or um, secondary sources is all about, borrowing credibility, okay? So let's look at logos and see exactly what we have, right? So I'm opening the file, and then I'm going to make it bigger so we can actually see it, okay? And you can see that it says logos is a logical appeal, a way of persuading an audience by reason or logic, okay? This appeal looks to logic, okay? And you present your evidence. Usually it's based in facts, okay? Examples, precedents, things that already happened, authority, and reasoning, deductive and inductive reasoning, okay? So let's look at some examples that appeal to logos. The data is perfectly clear. This investment has consistently turned a profit year over year, even in spite of market declines in other areas. Well, right away it says the data, which when you scroll back here and look, that would fall under facts, okay? And because data are facts, they're very hard to debate, okay? Because generally they represent the truth. So, for example, we say there's air in this room. That's not really debatable. That particular set of data is as factual as we can get. Why? Because how do we know there's air in the room? Well, because we're breathing and we're alive. And what does that mean? Well, that means that if we didn't have air in the room, we wouldn't be able to breathe and we would die. Okay? So right away, we start off with a fact. So moving on, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have not only the fingerprints, the lack of an alibi, a clear motive, and an expressed desire to commit the robbery, we also have a video of the suspect breaking in. This case could not be more open and shut. Okay. Again, evidence. It's a matter of common sense that people deserve to be treated equally. The Constitution calls it self-evident. Why then should I have been denied a seat because of my disability? More than 100 peer-reviewed studies have been conducted over the past decade, None of them suggest that this is an effective treatment for hair loss. History has shown us time and again that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And there's the history, that's precedent, right? Precedent is something that's happened historically that we use now and call it true. You hear that a lot on courtroom shows where a lawyer will argue precedents. They'll say, Your Honor, there was a case, Smith versus Barron, in 1953, where blah, 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 and it's the same essentially as this case. So, because we have a precedent, the judge will rule in favor of the precedent and say, okay, we're going to rule the same way. In other words, why would we reinvent the wheel? Okay. Private demand for the product has tapered off for the past 3 years, and this year's figures are at an all time low. It's time to research other options. In 25 years of driving the same route, I haven't seen a single deer. He has a track record of success with this company, culminating in some of the most acclaimed architecture to date and earning us Firm of the Year 9 times in a row. You don't need to jump off a bridge to know that it's a bad idea. Why then do you need to try drugs to know if they're damaging? That's plain nonsense. Research compiled by analysts from NASA as well as organizations from 5 other nations with space programs suggests that a moon colony is viable with international support. So, how many of these were you able to spot? Hopefully, they're pretty clear. Uh, Go back and read through the definitions again and look and see which would fit. Okay, I did the first couple. You can do the remainders. So that's logic, guys. And again, it's the principal point of our argument because we have that in common with each other, the idea of logic. Okay? Now, the other big thing that we have in common is emotion, and that would be pathos. And you might recognize the pathos, the PATH, with the word, for example, pathetic. All right? And generally speaking, that is a passion or emotional appeal, where we're convincing an audience of an argument by creating an emotional response. Okay? This kind of a feel can be very effective, guys, if it's not overdone, particularly if your topic is, in fact, an emotional one. Because your audience has emotions as well as intellect, your argument needs to seek to engage the audience emotionally. Okay? Think of the big arguments, guys, that people argue nationally. For example, abortion. It doesn't get much more emotional than the abortion argument. Okay, they tap into women's rights. They tap into all kinds of emotional sidebars, which is very effective. Okay, but you got to be careful when you're using emotions because it can get too much. All right, think of a stew. You're making a stew, right? 95% of that stew needs to be, the meat and the potatoes and the vegetables and the broth. The other 5% are the seasonings, right? They're not actually giving the taste to the stew, they're enhancing it. And that's the idea of an emotional appeal. You want to enhance, not overwhelm. Okay. Now, there are two things having to do with emotions that we need to talk about that are very, very important. And that is denotation and connotation. Okay. And you can see that denotation, D for dictionary, refers to the definition of a word. So if I have a word and I look it up in a dictionary, I can see the meaning of it. That's the denotation. Connotation, on the other hand, refers to words that carry secondary meanings or undertones or implications. Okay? For example, if you were to ask a woman how she'd like to be described from these 3 words, what do you think the answer would be for the most part? Slender, thin, or scrawny? The denotation of these words is essentially the same, okay? But the connotation is a little bit different, right? So slender is the more pleasant of the 3 words. Thin implies um, more neutrality, but it's still leaning towards unhealthy. And of course, scrawny brings to mind an unhealthy appearance, or a bony, skinny, thin, scrawny reference. Okay. And generally speaking, women don't want to be described in that manner. Okay. So you either want to stay neutralish with thin, or you want to go to the more positive word, which is slender. Okay. And you can see that the best way to incorporate the emotional appeals is by using the words that carry the appropriate connotations. And this is the hard part, guys, especially if you're a second language speaker, because while you might have a grasp on the connotation or the denotation of words, the connotation is something that you get over time, okay, by immersing yourself in a culture, all right? And connotation can change from area to area, region to region, culture to culture, okay? I might say something in a certain region of the country that has a different connotation than it does in a different region, okay? So you want to be careful, all right? Um, Here's an example, all right? Look at this sentence. I am not a crack addict. I am not a welfare mother. I am not illiterate. Crack addict, welfare mother, and illiterate carry very strong negative connotations. It makes the above statement, while already logical, much more powerful. However, you can hurt somebody's feelings, so to speak, by using some of those words, even though, they may be accurate. So in that case, you could try to soften it by saying, I am not a person who abuses substances. That's not as offensive as crack addict. I'm not a parent who needs government assistance. Again, not as offensive as welfare mother. And I can read. Okay, to the literate one. Notice how the emotional appeal is a little bit weaker. It's a little softer, not necessarily weaker. Okay. And even though the logical appeal is present, the statement no longer carries the same punch because you're using softer words, if you will. And that's how we want to be aware of the emotional appeal, guys. All right. Let's look at some examples. If we don't move soon, we're all going to die. Can't you see how dangerous it would be to stay? It's a good sentence. However, it's not really telling you any facts. Why? Why are we going to die? Why is it dangerous? What's going to happen if we don't leave? It's not bothering to tell you. It's just trying to grab your emotions and motivate you via emotions. Okay? I'm not just invested in this community. I love every building, every business, every hardworking member of this town. There's no price that can be placed on peace of mind. Our advanced security systems will protect the well-being of your family so that you can sleep soundly at night. Where would we be without this tradition? Ever since our forefathers landed at Plymouth Rock, we've celebrated Thanksgiving without fail. Making more than cherished recipes, we've made memories. Again, they're tweaking your emotions, right? All you have to do is turn on the TV and watch ads and commercials and watch how they do it. Yes, they will state facts, but they will also tweak your emotions. And not just with words, but with images as well. Okay? Heartwarming images, or sad images, or shocking images. These are all pathos appeals. Okay? You can read the rest of these examples on your own. You get the idea. We all have emotions. Of course you do. Okay? Now, let's move to the final piece of the argument, piece of the seasoning, if you will, and that becomes ethos. Okay? Now, as we look at these examples, see if you can spot the credibility. Okay? And you can see this is the appeal that involves convincing your audience that you are intelligent and can be trusted. In other words, you have credibility. Okay? Now, most of the topics that we write about, we don't really have the credibility. For example, in the model, I argue that marijuana should be legal in the state of Georgia. That's my issue. That's my position. But I provide 3 pieces of evidence, okay, to back myself up. I don't have a whole lot of credibility, specifically with those statistics. So when I say to you, for example, one of my reasons is that it brings in tax dollars, right? When something is legal, you can tax it. And as a result, You can make money for the state. Okay. How do I know? I'm an English teacher. Okay. I don't have any idea. So what I do is I look up a state that already legalized it, i.e., Colorado, and I quote some of their tax figures. For example, the year before they raised this much tax, and the year after they legalized it, they quadrupled that amount. That's my credential. That's my expertise. I'm borrowing from the treasurer, I guess, of Colorado, and I'm using his expertise to bolster my argument. And that's what this is all about, the ethos. Okay? Let's look at some examples. And you'll see it right away, right? This one, it starts off with credibility as a doctor. Bingo, right there. That's my credibility. Now, if he says anything having to do with medical, we believe him. Why? Because he's a doctor. So he says, as a doctor, I'm qualified to tell you that this course of treatment will likely generate the best results. My 3 decades of experience starts off with it. Why would you believe him? Well, because he's got 30 years of experience in public service. The veterinarian says, and immediately if they start talking about a pet, you believe him because he's a vet. Okay, now we're talking about caution is the best policy in this sort of situation. Why would we believe him? Well, because he was years as a Marine. And, Marines are taught caution. Okay. Me, you can use me as an example. Okay. I'm a doctor. However, I'm a doctor of language, of English. I have a PhD. Okay. So if you want to ask me almost any question about English or writing, I'm an expert. I have the credentials. I have the degrees. I have 7 published novels, etc., etc. I'm an expert. However, if someone drops over in a restaurant grabbing their chest and they yell, "Is there a doctor in the house?" I'm not going to say, "Here I am," because unless you want me to conjugate a verb, I can't help you, right? I'm not that kind of a doctor. And that ties in with advertisement. When you hear them say something like 4 out of 5 doctors recommend, what kind of doctors are recommending it? Are they doctors that have PhDs or are they medical doctors? Okay. So if we're talking about toothpaste and we say 4 out of 5 doctors recommend this toothpaste, really, unless they're dentists, who cares? It doesn't matter. Okay. So it's the relativity of the example of the credential. You have to make sure it's relative. And sometimes advertisers don't make that clear. They rely on people to ignore it, right? Well, if they hear 4 out of 5 doctors, they're immediately going to have confidence. And for the most part, that's true. It's not accurate, but it's true. Okay? So that, excuse me, in a nutshell, is ethos or credentials. You can see it's all about experience. Okay? Now, you may be an expert in your field, whatever your field may be. Okay? But for the most part, in what we're writing about in this class, you're not going to be experts in what we're writing about. That's why we use secondary sources, guys. Okay? We borrow the credibility of real experts and we use it to bolster our argument. Okay? And that is the whole point of ethos. Okay? So we have the ethos, the pathos, and the logos. 95%, 5%, and 5%. 95% logic, 5% pathos and ethos. Okay? You don't want to do much more than that. Otherwise, you're going to over-season your argument like a stew. Okay? Now, there's a worksheet in here that you can refer to that can help you break yours out. And I strongly recommend that you watch this little 25-minute video called Persuasive Methods in TV Commercials. It has to do with what we were just talking about. Okay? Not to mention the fact that it uses a lot of old-timey cartoons and they're very entertaining, right? When you see Fred Flintstone and Barney Rubble from the show The Flintstones smoking cigarettes and advertising cigarettes, that's entertainment, pal. All right. Okay, so that will cap off our part 2. Stay tuned for part 3.